Imagine if Malaysia, the Philippines, and Indonesia all teamed up to create one giant country, a superpower called MAPHILINDO. Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia, MAPHILINDO. I mean, three of the biggest countries and biggest economies in Southeast Asia all uniting to create one mega superstate. One great nation ruling over one of the busiest sea routes and trade hubs in the world. It sounds epic, right? And that is exactly what most people think when they hear MAPHILINDO, the Southeast Asian superpower that never was. But the thing is, in reality, MAPHILINDO was nothing like that. A lot of people think that MAPHILINDO was a failed plan to unite the islands of Southeast Asia into one massive country. And if you think about it, that is over 26,000 islands, all packed into one thriving region, a vast maritime superpower, at the crossroads of ancient kingdoms, with more than 1,200 languages, and one of the world's most important trade routes in history, one that is worth trillions of dollars today. But this is not about a failed country. It is about a failed idea, and what that idea actually tells us about Southeast Asia. So, what really happened? What exactly was MAPHILINDO? Let's dig deeper and find out. Mabuhay! Or in Kapampangan, luwid kayo! And salam to our Muslim viewers! Welcome to my channel, it's me Kirby Araullo, your friendly Pinoy historian. And in today's video, we're diving deep into MAPHILINDO. And for those who may not know, MAPHILINDO was a short-lived alliance that only lasted a few months, but actually left a lasting impact on the history and geopolitics of Southeast Asia. We'll break down what MAPHILINDO really was, why it failed so quickly, and why people still get it wrong. We'll look at the historical context, the diplomacy, the collapse, and the forgotten contradiction at the heart of it all. So first, MAPHILINDO emerged in the early 1960s, a critical moment when the Cold War was shaping global politics and newly independent Southeast Asian nations were trying to carve out their own identities. Indonesia had just freed itself from centuries of Dutch colonialism. In 1949, after a brutal revolution, the Philippines broke free from the Spaniards and declared independence in 1898. But the first Philippine Republic was brutally crushed by the Americans, and full independence didn't come until 1946, after decades under American rule. Meanwhile, Malaysia was still in the process of formation, transitioning from British colonial rule and preparing to become a new federation, including Malaya, Singapore, Sarawak, and Sabah. And at the time, Singapore was still part of this planned federation, although it would soon leave to become an independent country in 1965. Brunei, on the other hand, another Malay sultanate, notably declined to join this federation, choosing to remain separate under British protection. But independence didn't erase colonial influence overnight. Western powers still had deep economic, political, and military stakes in the region. And amid these tensions, Filipino President Diosdado Macapagal proposed a bold idea, MAPHILINDO, envisioned as a revival of the ancient unity of the Malay peoples, a culturally rooted alternative to Cold War alliances and colonial legacies. But it was not a country or even a formal union. It was a diplomatic platform to unite maritime Southeast Asia around shared history, culture, and regional self-determination. So, why do so many people think that MAPHILINDO was supposed to be this great federation, one great nation, Southeast Asia's modern superpower that never was? So part of the confusion comes from the name itself, MAPHILINDO, a catchy combination of Malaysia, Philippines, and Indonesia. It naturally sounds like one unified country, like the old Czechoslovakia, or a political and economic federation similar to Benelux or even the European Union. And this misunderstanding shows up in a lot of places. In textbooks, trivias, and even on social media. In fact, I've seen quite a lot of viral posts and even videos where they falsely claim that MAPHILINDO was this grand, ambitious political experiment to create one super country. And many others romanticize MAPHILINDO as a kind of a lost Malay empire, invoking nostalgia for historical maritime kingdoms like Srivijaya, Majapahit, and the Malacca Sultanate, pre-colonial kingdoms that once united parts of Southeast Asia under powerful empires. However, the truth is, MAPHILINDO is not as grand or glamorous as these posts and viral videos claim to be. MAPHILINDO was never intended as a political union or federation. In fact, at the 1963 Manila Summit, MAPHILINDO was clearly described as a non-political confederation of nations. There were no binding treaties, no shared government, no joint military force, nor even economic agreements. The alliance was primarily cultural and diplomatic. emphasizing racial solidarity, historical affinity, and mutual respect for national sovereignty. But these misconceptions persist because simplified historical narratives are much easier to make sense of than, complicated political realities. And this myth remains popular because it feeds into powerful emotions. Stories of lost unity and what could have been, stories of potential greatness. It makes MAPHILINDO sounds like a great dream, ruined by outsiders, ruined by colonialism. But that version skips over the real story. It ignores the deep political tensions and ideological differences between Indonesia, the Philippines, and Malaysia. It ignores that each of these countries had their own agendas, deeply contradicting agendas that made genuine unity or a true federation impossible. So in reality, the MAPHILINDO Summit of July 1963 made it clear there would be no single government, no political union, and each country would keep its own independence, its own sovereignty. Okay, so let us get this one thing straight. MAPHILINDO was a diplomatic alliance. It was not a political union of three big nations uniting into one superpower. I mean, yes, for sure, this idea of uniting these islands under one banner has been fascinating people for generations, for centuries, throughout history. But the thing is, in reality, that was never what MAPHILINDO was meant to be. It was never intended to be this one great mega superstate. MAPHILINDO was officially formed at the Manila Summit in July 1963. Its founders, Philippine President Diosdado Macapagal, Indonesian President Sukarno, and Malayan Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman, clearly called it a non-political confederation. The goal was simple but ambitious: to promote unity among the newly independent nations by highlighting their shared culture, their shared history. Unlike Western alliances like NATO or CETO, MAPHILINDO deliberately avoided any kind of political or economic integration. So MAPHILINDO's founding document, the Manila Accord, laid out a number of clear but limited goals. So first, MAPHILINDO aimed to resolve regional disputes peacefully, particularly the heated and contentious Philippine claim to Sabah or North Borneo. And second, MAPHILINDO sought to affirm and celebrate the historical roots and cultural unity of the Malay peoples across Southeast Asia, drawing inspiration from the powerful empires of Srivijaya and the Majapahit. And lastly, but definitely not the least, MAPHILINDO firmly took a non-aligned stance, deliberately choosing to stay independent from the ongoing Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. So despite these lofty goals, MAPHILINDO had very little structure. There was no formal secretariat, no shared laws, and definitely no joint military or defense pact. Instead, MAPHILINDO depended entirely on the goodwill, consensus, and personal diplomacy between leaders. So at its core, MAPHILINDO was a symbolic gesture of cultural unity, an attempt to revive a shared Malay identity, a shared heritage that had long been fractured by colonial borders and global geopolitics. Then President Macapagal famously captured this sentiment during his opening speech at the summit. But then again, the contradictions were clear from the very beginning. For example, cultural solidarity was appealing. It looks good on paper. But the lack of concrete mechanisms for resolving actual political disputes and tensions between nations, the alliance had no solid foundation. And sadly, within just a few months, those unresolved tensions and clashing national interests would push MAPHILINDO to its breaking point. So, with such promising goals, what exactly went wrong? How and why exactly did the great united MAPHILINDO ended up an epic fail? So in short, reality took over idealism almost immediately. The breaking point came in September 1963 when the Federation of Malaysia was officially formed. It included Sabah and Sarawak, territories that had been under British colonial rule. So both Indonesia and the Philippines strongly objected. So Indonesian President Sukarno viewed Malaysia's creation as a neo-colonial plot orchestrated by Britain to weaken Indonesia's influence in the region. In his eyes, Malaysia wasn't an expression of genuine self-determination, but it was a foreign interference masquerading as independence. And this perception drove Sukarno to launch Konfrontasi, an undeclared war involving military incursions, sabotage, and aggressive diplomatic propaganda against Malaysia. Sukarno's actions blatantly violated the foundational principles of the Manila Accord, particularly non-interference, and peaceful conflict resolution. And around the same time, the Philippines also faced a domestic political dilemma. President Macapagal's government had publicly committed to resolve the Sabah dispute peacefully, yet nationalist pressures at home in the Philippines demanded assertive action to reclaim what many considered historically Philippine territory. So for those who may not know, the Philippine claim over Sabah was rooted in an 1878 agreement between the Sultanate of Sulu and the British, wherein the Sultan of Sulu leased rather than ceded the territory of North Borneo or Sabah to British interest. And this made any diplomatic resolution more complicated. And interestingly, unknown to many, Macapagal himself was a direct descendant of the Sultans of Sulu and Brunei, two sultanates historically linked to Sabah, aka North Borneo. So when Malaysia incorporated the territory of North Borneo or Sabah without addressing the claims of the Philippines or the Sultan of Sulu, Manila felt betrayed, further escalating diplomatic tensions. And if you're interested, the Sabah dispute itself is a tangled web of colonial-era agreements, of shifting alliances, and of competing sultanates. And I actually created an entire video series about this, just unpacking its messy history. And if you want to learn more, and if you want the full tea, make sure to watch my Sabah and Sulu playlist after this video. Now back to MAPHILINDO. With no secretariat, no formal institutions, and no binding agreements, MAPHILINDO proved to be unable to prevent or resolve the rapidly deteriorating relations among its members. And so within weeks of the Federation's declaration, both Indonesia and the Philippines severed diplomatic ties with Malaysia. Bilateral tensions replaced trilateral unity. The alliance was left effectively defunct. Now on top of this, Cold War politics made things even worse. Indonesia under Sukarno was leaning more towards leftist and anti-Western alliances. Meanwhile, the Philippines stayed closely aligned with the United States, while Malaysia on the other hand had deeper ties with the British and the Commonwealth. And as you can see, these clashing loyalties and alliances widened the divide between the three nations. And in the end, the vision of unity couldn't survive the political realities. So sadly, by the early 1964, just months after it began, MAPHILINDO had completely fallen apart, and the dream of uniting these islands was overshadowed by rivalries. The optimism at its birth was quickly replaced by mistrust. But hold on. If MAPHILINDO fell apart so quickly, then why are people still talking about it to this very day? Despite the fact that MAPHILINDO's lifespan was very brief, the legacy MAPHILINDO left behind resonated far beyond the 60s. And even though the alliance collapsed quickly, MAPHILINDO's core ideals of regional solidarity, of cultural unity, anti-colonial identity, and the principle of non-interference in sovereign affairs laid the groundwork for future diplomacy in Southeast Asia. In fact, these very same values became the guiding principles in the formation of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. So when ASEAN emerged 4 years later, it deliberately adopted several principles directly inspired by the failures and aspirations of MAPHILINDO. ASEAN took clear lessons from MAPHILINDO. It embraced core principles like making decisions by consensus, respecting each other's national sovereignty, and finding peaceful ways to settle conflicts. However, ASEAN also made a conscious choice to avoid what brought down MAPHILINDO. So instead of relying on ethnic or cultural unity like MAPHILINDO, ASEAN took a more practical approach. It focused more on economic cooperation, flexible diplomacy, and building strong institutions that could survive political change and regional tensions. So MAPHILINDO's failures taught Southeast Asia some very hard but necessary lessons. It showed that shared culture and history are not enough to hold an alliance together. Without strong institutions or formal agreements, regional cooperation can quickly fall apart, especially when nationalism and global geopolitics came into play. And yet, MAPHILINDO left its mark in other ways. In the Philippines, school textbooks continued to emphasize our shared Malay cultural and historical connections for decades. And similar cultural narratives also persisted in both Indonesia and Malaysia, shaping how their people saw their own national identities and fostering a lasting consciousness of shared history despite political tensions. So even if the politics didn't last, the sense of shared heritage remained. And today, as historians, we don't just see MAPHILINDO as a failure. We see it as a turning point, a key chapter in how Southeast Asia started learning to stand on its own. And it showed both the power and the limits of using culture and shared history as the foundation for diplomacy. And even if the alliance didn't last, MAPHILINDO helped lay the groundwork for a more robust and inclusive regional cooperation. And at the end of the day, MAPHILINDO was important, It mattered because of what it represented. MAPHILINDO was a powerful demonstration of Southeast Asia's desire to shape its own future, free from colonial interference. And that vision still matters today. MAPHILINDO's ideals echo even now, reminding us that genuine regional unity is built not simply on shared past or shared cultures, but more importantly, on mutual respect, inclusive cooperation, and strengthening institutional resilience. So the truth is, MAPHILINDO was not a failed supercountry, but it was a fragile diplomatic experiment. It was idealistic, ambitious, but ultimately undone by the realities of global geopolitics. Understanding what MAPHILINDO truly was and was not matters a big deal even for us today. It provides us with critical insight into the complexities of post-colonial diplomacy, identity politics, and sovereignty. The collapse of this alliance was not simply a missed opportunity or a lost dream of regional unity. It was a reflection of deeper, persistent tensions that continue to shape Southeast Asia's political landscape. And if you think about it, MAPHILINDO teaches us to question overly simplified historical narratives because too often, history is watered down into convenient myth, like the idea that a Southeast Asian federation failed just because of bad timing, conspiracy, or foreign interference. But the truth is more complicated. In reality, MAPHILINDO failed because of deep internal contradictions, unresolved territorial disputes, clashing national interest, and fragile diplomacy. And to be honest, the story of MAPHILINDO is not just about the past. MAPHILINDO is also about understanding how we approach unity, cooperation, and solidarity, helping us think more clearly about what unity really means. Like, how do we balance sovereignty with shared goals? How can diverse nations work together without losing their identities? And how do we build lasting institutions that can survive political turmoil? Because let's face it, these are not just old questions from the 60s. In fact, they matter now more than ever, especially with ASEAN navigating rising tensions, from territorial disputes in the South China Sea to the growing pressures from global powers. But answering these questions takes more than just diplomacy. It takes vision, courage, and a shared commitment to something bigger than any one nation. So MAPHILINDO may have failed, but it was not pointless. Learning from the experiment called MAPHILINDO will help us better understand the conditions necessary to create genuine progress and genuine solidarity in Southeast Asia. I mean, let's face it, Southeast Asia is not just some small corner of the world. It is home to over 700 million people, a population that keeps growing. And if you think about it, that is almost 1 in every 12 people in the entire planet. These islands have always been a thriving hub of diverse cultures and trade. So what happens in Southeast Asia echoes globally, not just today, but even long before colonialism. Now, I know a lot of you are probably asking, or even thinking, or wondering, are Filipinos even Malay? I mean, that's the whole point of MAPHILINDO, uniting the Malay people, the Malay cultures. But the thing is, that question is complicated. This whole idea of a shared Malayo identity is not as simple as it sounds. But don't worry, we'll unpack that in a future video, so stay tuned. And if you want to understand what came after MAPHILINDO, including how its collapse led to the formation of ASEAN, don't forget to check out my other videos on this channel to learn more about Southeast Asia's fascinating history, cultures, and everything in between. Or you can also grab copies of any of my books, coloring books, ebooks, and merch in the links below. Maraming salamat po o in bahasa Melayu, terima kasih. In Kapampangan, dakal pong salamat kay Kongan. See you next time or in Tagalog kita gets in Kapampangan, Mikitix and in bahasa Indonesia, sampai nanti.